Welcome back, everybody. In this video, we're going to talk about ratios and how you can check for yourself and analyze the ratios on various charts. We're going to talk about PulseX versus Pulse. We're going to talk about eHEX versus pHEX. But we're going to talk about the concept and how to do it for yourself, how to think in terms of ratios and how to get them to show on the chart. It's a simple concept, but a lot of people out there might not fully understand it yet. And we do this a lot, especially in the PulseChain ecosystem. We love talking about ratios and liquidity bonding, but it's very confusing for a newbie. And I know Richard Hart was on stream on the HEX Christmas stream that he did, talking about, for example, the PLSX PLS ratio. And this is something that a lot of people have their eye on. I mean, PulseX is primarily priced in terms of Pulse. Okay, so when I talk about ratios, you can basically see on Dex Screener right here, there's all kinds of websites you can use. I like Dex Screener, GoPulse.com, HexScout.com, PulseCoinList.com. They all kind of show the same charts and they all use the underlying Dex Screener software. So if you click on these charts over here, right, it's also just going to pull up a chart directly from Dex Screener. But it's important to get familiar with charts like this. And when we talk about ratios, what do we mean? We're actually just talking about in the top left corner here, what's on one side and what's on the other side. Okay, so you've got Pulse paired with DAI. That would mean for this chart, we're talking about the PLS DAI liquidity pool specifically. And we're talking about Pulse relative to DAI stablecoin. Let's pull that up here. I like to get rid of this transaction stuff and have a clean chart right here. Now, what we're all used to when it comes to ratios, right, is we're used to pricing things in US dollars. Okay, so that's why the price in USD is always going to show up on any chart, regardless of if it's a ratio of, let's say, PulseX to Pulse. This one is a ratio of Pulse to DAI stablecoin, meaning there really is no other ratio other than PulseChain priced in dollars. And this primary ratio is what everybody cares about. Okay, everybody only cares about at the end of the day the price of the coin relative to dollars, because we're all saving dollars, we're all earning dollars, but those dollars are being devalued by inflation. So the goal is to obviously have a coin that outperforms the dollar. So with this Pulse DAI pair, it's very simple to understand because it's basically just saying Pulse USD. A DAI stablecoin is worth 1 USD, so it's not really too complicated. But if you did want to flip it to the price in DAI, I just want everybody to know this. I mean, it probably is obvious to a lot of people that have been doing this for a while. But when you're on the Dex Screener chart, you're going to click up right here. Look where my mouse is right here. This button is really critical to understand because this flips the chart in terms of USD value to the actual ratio of whatever's on the other side of the liquidity pair. But in this case, remember, the liquidity pair is just Pulse DAI stablecoin. And wrapped Pulse is basically the same as Pulse. It's like saying wrapped ETH. WPLS is always going to have the same price as PLS. So for anybody new, all the W means is that it's wrapped to be tradable as an ERC20 coin. And if you want to flip the ratio, you just click this right here and you say switch to price in DAI. But you'll notice right here, the chart looks exactly the same. And it should look exactly the same because DAI and USD are the same coin. They're both $1. And I could switch the price back to USD. Look, I'm hovering over this little button here and we just click on this to go back to the US dollar price. This is going to make more sense when we go to a well-known ratio like PulseX and Pulse. Now, a lot of people have their eyes on this ratio, right? PulseX has been outperforming Pulse. PulseX has been moving up relative to Pulse faster than I expected. A lot of people, including myself, if you were liquidity bonding, you probably have some impermanent loss right now because the ratio of PulseX relative to Pulse has been going up a lot. So now look at this pair, and I'll tell you how to kind of analyze the Dex Screener chart. Up here, we've got PulseX relative to WPLS. So it's PulseX priced in PLS terms. But remember, they're always going to show you the USD chart by default, the USD price. And they always default US dollars on the Y-axis here because that's what people are comfortable with. That's what people are familiar with. But if you understand ratios, this also actually helps for liquidity bonding. When you're yield farming, you want to make sure that you enter and exit at relatively the same ratio if you can. Otherwise, if that ratio changes drastically in a year, you're going to have some impermanent loss. So that's yield farming, but that's why you also get paid INT token to make up for that impermanent loss. A lot of people just have to play around with like $10 or $100 just to get a sense for this because, it's one thing to explain it, but it's another thing to just go experiment with your own money that you take it a lot more seriously. But now look at the price in PLS terms. Okay, PulseX is worth 0.66 of a WPLS. Okay, so that means basically that PulseX is worth 66% of Pulse. Okay, it's worth about 2/3 what a Pulse is worth. Now, will these actually get to parity? At the beginning, I'm going to be honest, I didn't think they were going to get to parity, but now we've seen so much strength in PulseX, and maybe we've seen so many weak hands get rinsed out that perhaps it might be easier for PulseX to pump, especially considering it's the endpoint. Whereas Pulse, a lot of the buy pressure through Pulse does exactly that. It goes through Pulse and it ends up at the endpoints, which are coins like HEX, PulseX, or all these other meme coins, all these other alternative coins. So I could see the argument either way. On one hand, you could say, okay, well, Pulse had a shorter sacrifice phase, less people involved in it. PulseX had a sacrifice phase about 3 times as long, about 3 times as many people. So you've got more players, more weak hands to shake out. But we also saw PulseX go down harder than PLS. And now that they're both kind of gearing up for 2025, PulseX is gaining on PLS. So let's click on the ratio chart, remember, which is right here. It's always going to be right here where my mouse is. It's really important to just click on these ratio charts and just try to analyze what's going on this way. I've got this volume profile on here. I'll get rid of this because it's not important right now. So notice when I change this to a ratio, okay? Now you can see that, well, we started off at about a 2-to-1 ratio almost, 0.5 to 1 right here. Then we dipped down all the way to the point where it was almost a 4-to-1 ratio. At the beginning, I was kind of predicting that it would bounce around between 2-to-1 and 4-to-1. When I say a 2-to-1 ratio, I'm just talking about the inverse of 0.5. Okay, so when you're seeing 0.5 here, that means that PulseX is worth half as much as Pulse, otherwise known as a 2 PulseX per every 1 Pulse. And all the way at the lows here, when PulseX dipped super hard relative to Pulse, remember, because we're on the PLS ratio chart up here, it dipped all the way down to 0.25, meaning PulseX was 25% of a Pulse, or you could also say that it was 4 PulseX for every 1 Pulse, right? If you just do 1 divided by 0.25, that equals 4. So, I mean, this concept is probably a review again for a lot of people, but the more you can familiarize yourself with this, the more you can make a better decision on, for example, if you want to LP, or just get a better sense of what the market is valuing. And right now, it's very interesting. I mean, Richard Hart was tweeting about PulseX. A lot of people have been buying it up lately. The buy and burn has burned over 5% of all the user supply. We had a single day where I think $300,000 was burned in a single day of PulseX, $300,000 worth. So there's always this automatic buy and burn mechanism, which is making PulseX more valuable, even regardless of if people are trading PulseX. They could be trading some other coin, and those transaction fees are going to buy and burn PulseX, which is also why it's important to have as much liquidity and as much volume as possible routing through PulseX if you want to maximize that buy and burn. That's kind of another story. But look at this ratio here. I did not expect this to happen, okay? I did not expect PulseX to show so much strength and go from a 2-to-1 ratio now to be worth 66% of a Pulse, right? Now, the big question is it going to go to parity? Is it going to go to parity? And for that to happen, we'd have to go, we'd have to do something like this and then end up at this 1-to-1. And there's also no reason that it would stay at this 1-to-1 mark, right? There's no reason that it has to stay up here and peg to a 1-to-1 ratio. It could go past. If the market is valuing PulseX more than Pulse, there's no reason that it couldn't be worth more than Pulse. But just from the starting place, from having a sacrifice phase that was longer and bigger and more weak hands, more jeets to shake out, that's why you got a lot of downward sell pressure for the first year or so of PulseX's existence. But very interesting to keep an eye on. So right now, if you want to enter this yield farm right now, is this a good idea? I don't know, because this chart is hard to really draw any lines on. You might be able to draw support here and a resistance here, but if we drew support here and drew another support line there, you can see this is kind of a magnetic mark, this 2-to-1 ratio, but we're well past that now. So we're in no man's land over here. We're uncharted territory. There's not really a whole lot of technical analysis you can do to predict how high it's going to go. But it could always retrace, right? It could always retrace, and that is the risk that you take. So when you're bonding your PulseX to Pulse in the yield farms, that's why me personally, I don't really put in more than maybe 25 or 30% of my whole portfolio into a yield farm. Because right now, like I said, I entered the yield farm somewhere around here, thinking that maybe a 3-to-1 ratio was going to be safe. But clearly now it's double that. So I am sitting in some pretty heavy impermanent loss, which I don't care because I plan on holding for a very long time. I've already been in the yield farm since day one. I'm probably going to remain in them for a long time to come. But ideally, let's say I put my yield farm in here. Let's say I put my liquidity position in right around here where this red line is. I would hope that eventually, the market goes back down and meets me at this red line here, in which case I'd pull it back out at no impermanent loss and have been earning INT that whole time. Now, that's the dream, right? That's the perfect world. Markets are unpredictable. So the reason you're getting INT payouts is to reward you for this exact risk of if you're going to yield farm Pulse versus PulseX, or if you're going to yield farm HEX versus Pulse, or eHEX versus pHEX, okay? Let's talk about eHEX versus pHEX. All right, this one's very interesting. Now, is eHEX going to die? Well, not really. You can't really kill it ever because it's just a smart contract. It's going to live no matter what. It all depends on how much attention people are choosing to give it and how much people are bridging it to bond it with HEX. Actually, we're on the wrong ratio right here, okay? So we're on eHEX versus PLS. Let's go find the eHEX versus PHEX chart. So we're going to search here on our DEX screener. We're going to go find eHEX HEX, okay? This is HEX from Ethereum, down here where my mouse is, being paired to PHEX. So if you're wondering, this is the more interesting chart, in my opinion, when you're talking about eHEX. Now, how high or low will the ratio go? Again, we can see the USD price. We default to the USD price. Remember, on the y-axis is defaulted at, 1/3 of a penny. But what I want to talk about in the video is switching to the ratio. Switch to the price in HEX terms. So how much is eHEX priced in HEX terms? 0.2, which means about 20%, otherwise known as a 5-to-1 ratio. It's about 5 eHEX to every 1 PHEX. In other words, 1 eHEX is 20% of a PHEX. Now, you saw the Richard Hart kill tweet over here. Everybody, people are always going to be arguing about this. I mean, I don't think the arguments are ever going to stop. I don't know what's going to happen. Okay. On one hand, you could say, well, Ethereum Classic versus Ethereum is like 100-to-1 ratio. But a lot of people, the cult community of eHEX, PHEX holders, they're keeping it alive. And a good way to see the ratio also is GoPulse.com also calculates the eHEX, PHEX ratio. I like that they do that over here. So we got 1 to 4.9. It's about a 5-to-1 ratio. Remember, about 5 eHEX per 1 PHEX. Obviously, PHEX is the more expensive one because it's the one that's actually useful. It's on the cheaper blockchain. Staking it is actually effective. You can unstake it with cheaper fees. The whole reason PulseChain was invented was for HEX, so that you didn't have to pay crazy high gas fees to unstake your eHEX. So there is no right or wrong answer of what you want to do with eHEX. You can keep buying it, I guess, if you like paying gas fees, or if you want to trade it as a meme coin over on CowSwap on the Ethereum side. Sure, you can do that, but I kind of prefer just bridging it in. So as my stakes come due, I'm bridging it over just to get it onto the network, onto the PulseChain network. Just being on the PulseChain network, bridging your eHEX over into PulseChain. It's going to increase the value of the whole network. You get more TVL on there, and there's different liquidity plays. So for one thing you could do is you could bond eHEX with HEX. If you bond eHEX and HEX, today I think you're making, well, let's go find out what the APY is. So if you ever want to see the APY for a regular pair, go over here to the info page on PulseX, go to V2 over here. You can scroll down to the coin you want. Let's choose HEX from Ethereum. Now, this page does take a while to load, but this is a good way to see how much fees you'd be earning for that risk of impermanent loss. So V1 pools, just for people that might be new, the V1 pools are the ones that pay out an INC token, but you don't actually earn transaction fees. V2, you don't get any INC token, but you earn transaction fees. So here we've got HEX from Ethereum. We could scroll down to the pools over here. We're going to wait for this to load because the main pool that we care about, remember, is eHEX to PHEX in this scenario. And the big question is, will it ever get to parity, right? 1-to-1 parity. Well, before PulseChain launched, everybody was talking about that. I don't really see that conversation happening as much now. Is it still theoretically possible? Yes. I mean, eHEX and HEX could still go to parity, but, Richard Hart, I wouldn't count on him to be providing all the liquidity. There was this theory going around that theoretically, if there's enough liquidity in the HEX versus eHEX pair, that they could be at a 1-to-1 ratio, or they could be locked in at a specific, they could be pegged at a certain ratio, if you want to use that word. Here we go. The pools just came up. HEX is the pair that you want. Okay, this is basically eHEX and PHEX. We'll click on this and we'll see how much APY you're earning. But the question is, look, 28% APY, 29%, that's very, very high. That's actually incredibly high. But you're also putting yourself at a lot of impermanent loss risk because look at the volatility of this ratio. It used to be a 2-to-1 ratio. Then it went all the way down to a 10-to-1 ratio. Now it's at a 5-to-1 ratio. And it could go lower, right? Just because the low was 10-to-1 doesn't mean it couldn't be 20-to-1. What if PHEX keeps pumping and eHEX doesn't really get as much attention? Now, the thing about liquidity bonding is that what Hart's law basically says in layman's terms is that the more liquidity is in a pair, right? Right now there's $1.6 million. Let's say this was $100 million. Well, 1.6 is actually not that much, but if it was 100 million, then the prices would go up and down together much more closely because the more liquidity is in that pair, the more closely they're bonded versus each other, meaning if somebody buys PHEX, well, because they're so heavily liquidity bonded, eHEX would go along for the ride. Now, with this little amount of liquidity, almost 2 years into PulseChain, only $1.6 million, it seems like the market doesn't really care too much about even trying to peg this. maybe everybody was expecting Richard to do it. And he kind of basically tweeted and spelled it out for you like, hey, the market's decided. But he could always change his mind, right? I mean, Richard could always just tweet, hey, the market's decided that eHEX is pumping again, if that does happen. So that tweet was a funny thing. I wonder if Richard would even maybe regret making that tweet because I don't think he anticipated that people were going to be so emotional about that one single tweet. I mean, it's kind of an obvious statement. Yes, the market had already decided at this point PHEX was worth double eHEX. I think the reason for him tweeting this is basically all the frustration with him saying, basically I built PulseChain to save you from high gas fees. Why are you guys still trading eHEX over on expensive places like CowSwap or Uniswap or whatever? Plus, Uniswap even delisted HEX too, so it's like, why give Uniswap any more attention and any more love? They've never been here to support us, so why are you going to go trade on Uniswap when PulseX was literally invented to get rid of Uniswap, to not be reliant on the gatekeepers at Uniswap? So that's why I get my eHEX over. I've been bonding some of it with UFO token. I've been bonding it with PHEX a little bit. But again, you open yourself up to this huge impermanent loss risk, okay? Like, just because we're at a 5-to-1 ratio today doesn't mean that we can't just keep going down, 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 like, Ethereum Classic. Or one day we can get to that mythical parity. Just expect that it's going to be chaos and expect the unexpected, right? You don't know how this is going to play out. Could just go kind of flat for a while. I mean, Richard Hart could do something with it later, but I wouldn't want to just sit around hoping and praying for, the origin address, whoever it might be, the Nigerian prince, whatever, to all of a sudden increase this liquidity to make it like $100 million and try to, stabilize this ratio. The market's going to keep deciding, and that's up to you at the end of the day. I'm not going to make that choice for you. Only you can make that choice. And what I'm doing, I'm doing a very tiny amount right now of eHEX, PHEX, just to see where it goes. I've been wrecked on this though. Like I was in this pool. I was in the eHEX, PHEX pool back before that one infamous tweet, right? And then I just got wrecked because everybody got emotional about this tweet that was basically just like recognizing something that was already happening. But it is what it is. And so, I've eaten that impermanent loss. And I guess the rest of the market didn't really care so much about trying to bond it either. So I've got a very little amount still left in here. But you do you. If you've got your eHEX over on PulseChain, you could swap it for another coin. You could do liquidity play. You could just trade it around or treat it like a meme coin because it probably will have a random pump or so throughout this. Just like, back here when it was a 10-to-1 ratio, we saw it retrace all the way up to almost a 3-to-1 ratio and recover, almost half of that, Richard Hart kill tweet, let's call it, or, market overreaction tweet. So, crazy things can happen. I mean, let's see how high this ratio went. It went from about 10-to-1 up to maybe 3-to-1. So, it did about a 3x almost, a 270% gain. So eHEX was gaining on PHEX during this time. Now it's back down again. And it's about 2x off of the all-time low of the ratio. But we just don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. Which is why, yes, you're earning 28%. But look at the volatility here. Is that 28% really going to cover you if something goes up 278%? No, I mean, the volatility here is like 10 times what the LP rewards are. So that's the risk that you take. And that is the famous eHEX PHEX ratio. Now, to peg it, whether it would be pegging at a 1-to-1 or whether it's pegging at the current ratio, which is 5-to-1, again, just to leave you with this, pegging does require a lot of liquidity over here. Probably a lot more than $1.6 million. That doesn't seem nearly enough. And it's kind of crazy how small that is, meaning the users didn't want to join me. They didn't want to also, back their PRC20 value by backing their eHEX with PHEX. So that was also probably partly to do with that, the market's decided tweet over here, because the market did decide. At what point do you just have to call it and say, well, nobody's providing liquidity and there's all this hopium of Richard Hart or, the origin address, like pegging these ratios together. And when that didn't happen, it's like, well, all right. So I'm kind of doing all different things. I'm experimenting. Like I said, personally with eHEX, I tied some to UFO, I tied some to PHEX, and I've actually swapped a lot just for HEX. At this point, I've swapped a lot for HEX, swapped a lot of eHEX for PHEX. Because in the Occam's razor solution, I do believe that, HEX will probably outperform eHEX unless something crazy happens. Yeah, I know Richard Hart says he doesn't want to see expensive, cheap HEX anywhere. but you also have to be dynamic and, update your opinion if market conditions change. So that's where we're at right now. I'm not saying I'm certain about anything, just saying that I'm kind of doing everything that there is to really do. It's not really that many options. It's like buy and hold, LP with UFO, LP with PHEX. Regardless, I feel like the right thing to do is at least bridge the eHEX over. And that's a conversation that could go for hours, probably. There's a lot to talk about here, but you have to decide at the end of the day, what do you want to do with eHEX? Some people aren't even touching it at all, and that's perfectly understandable. Why would you want to touch something that if you're not really sure if it's even going to be around when PHEX is here and it works on PulseChain and the staking is cheap and it actually is effective? Now, another thing you could do with eHEX is make like a long-term stake over on Ethereum, like a 3, 4, 5 year stake at least, because by that time, maybe Ethereum will actually have its gas fees figured out. There's going to be some EIP updates, and eHEX one day might actually have reasonable utility again without paying an arm and a leg for gas fees. But I feel like I'm getting into that debate a little too much. I want to focus us back on just the simple concept of ratios. Let's also just use INC and PulseX. Okay, INC and PulseX. Like I've said before, we're always defaulted to the price in US dollars on the y-axis, but clicking this up here changes the y-axis, clicking the ratio up here, and now the y-axis is priced in PulseX. So today it's 58,000 PulseX, 58,000 PulseX for every one INC token. And this is also a very interesting ratio chart as well. INC has been going down relative to PulseX. So one INC used to get you 120,000 PulseX. Now an INC will only get you 50,000 PulseX. Now what does this mean? Well, you could say that INC is going down relative to PulseX, or PulseX is going up relative to INC. So with this chart too, you can draw somewhat of a line here. We did stabilize at around this 120K PulseX per INC mark, but then, we slowly started to go down, meaning, if you're like me, I've got some impermanent loss right now. If you entered this yield farm, because you can also farm INC versus PulseX, but, what a yield farmer wants is a stable ratio. Your dream scenario would just be that this line is totally flat, and there's super high volume going on, getting all those fees, but there's super low volatility. That just doesn't really happen. I mean, high volume, low volatility, the only place you're going to get that is like a stablecoin pair, which is why they also pay out much lower, like 0.05% fees instead of like 0.3 with stablecoin pairs. But look, that's the game you're playing. Okay, if you're going to do yield farming, you need to expect impermanent loss. And I joined this yield farm, I don't know, somewhere around here. And for a while, I was like, wow, great. Everything is going flat. No impermanent loss. But now I've got about, 50% impermanent loss. Now, luckily that INC that I'm earning, I'm recompounding it and I'm earning it, and it's making up a little bit for that. But you also have to have some degree of just faith, that at some point in the future, we don't know what the chart's going to do. Could go all the way back to the bottom again, maybe retest the bottom, and maybe hopefully eventually, a year from now, come back to the place that you put in at. So you'd want to pull out at the very same ratio that you put it in at, which is why it's also good to keep track of this when you do start yield farming. Keep track of all the different points where you put in, keep track of what the ratios were at that time. And of course, if you wanted to, let's say, put in a little bit over here and a little bit over here, that could help you with your impermanent loss, because that would kind of equalize you. That would kind of average you out to have a ratio somewhere in the middle if you put in at the high point and if you put in at the low point. You know what I mean? But you'd have to do all that math yourself. You have to do the calculations. Yield farming is not for everybody. Okay, it's not quite passive. And if you're going to worry about, all these ratios going against you, you just need to have long-term conviction, or just don't do it at all. Or just do it with a small fraction of your bag. I sometimes see people do it with like 100% of their bag or something. And that's probably not a good idea. With your full stack, you probably don't want to go yield farming with everything you own. But, 10, 20, 30%, go ahead. Just expect that. These things are not going to stay flat and stable. Okay? So we'd want INC to start showing strength again. Right now, INC has been showing weakness, meaning, again, an INC used to get you 120K PulseX. Now, an INC is only getting you about 60,000 PulseX. So one INC token gets you 50% less PulseX today than it did back in April of 2024. So another way to think about this is you've got this INC to PulseX ratio. Look at the first ticker in the pair, okay? INC is the first ticker, right? And that is what the ratio chart is telling you. So remember, we're on the ratio chart because we click this button, and INC is the first ticker in the pair. So if the chart goes down, that means INC is going down relative to PulseX. chart goes up, INC is showing strength relative to PulseX. Meaning INC is buying you less PulseX down here, INC is buying you more PulseX up here. It's just kind of a different frame of mind to think about things because we're so used to just seeing dollars over here. But what about units of the actual tokens itself? If the goal is to maximize your amount of units of the token, because you think that it doesn't really matter, the prices are going to go 10, 100x one day, or maybe higher, you want to think in terms of units rather than dollars for that kind of scenario. If you're, let's say, accumulating Richard Heart tokens, or any token for that matter. So I hope that was somewhat helpful. You know, it's probably a review for a lot of people, a lot of PulseChain people. You know, we were educated by Richard Heart and we kind of know this stuff. We kind of know how ratios work and how every single price chart is just a ratio of one coin to another. So there's INC PulseX. Yes, it has $48 million of liquidity, but all that liquidity is in the form of INC and PulseX. There's actually no US dollars in this pool. Okay? They're just taking the USD price of PulseX and comparing that to INC, and that's $2.27. But if you're comparing INC to PulseX, today it's 58,000 PulseX. It's kind of funny. So even this dollar liquidity amount, this is $48 million worth of liquidity, but there's no dollars themselves in this pair. And that's the interesting thing about PulseX. Let's go back to the farms, for example. Most of the liquidity is actually bonded to the other coins in the ecosystem. Even HEX Pulse, look, $27 million, but there's no actual dollars here. You've got $53 million in PulseX Pulse, but there's no actual dollars there. You've got $36 million in INC Pulse, but that's all just tokens. It's units of a token, not dollars. The real important thing that makes number go up is the dollar price. And you'll notice that, you know, people like your friend Sami, they talk about Pulse being the spear. PLS is the spear, meaning it's the first thing you have to buy to get everything else. So if I want to buy PulseX, I have to buy first Pulse, you know, through one of these stablecoin pairs that actually pushes the price up of Pulse. And then it routes me through to PulseX at the endpoint. So it's a two-step process. It's 2 hops to get there. So if I've got some dollars and I want to get to HEX, first I've got to buy Pulse. Let's say I've got USDC and I'm buying HEX directly with USDC. Well, what's actually happening is that you're pushing the price up of Pulse with this pair, and then you're going down to this pair and you're pushing up Pulse and you're buying HEX. So you're pushing up Pulse relative to HEX. This is a cool dynamic system, or reflexive, I guess you could call it. And that means that when you're buying one of these endpoint coins, let's say even if you're buying INC token, you push up every other coin in the route on the way there. But at the end of the day, the real dollar value that matters is all these stable coins. So the actual stablecoin liquidity on the bid side is these 3 pairs divided by 2. So let's say 40 million plus 15 million plus 14 million. Let's say it's about 70 million. $70 million worth of stablecoin liquidity divided by 2, because there's an equal amount of coins on both sides. So there's about $35 million only, guys, of stablecoins tied to Pulse. There's $35 million of stablecoin liquidity basically backing this entire ecosystem. So yes, it's $700 million of TVL, but when you break it down, the actual dollars, the actual thing that makes the number go up, the price part, is only backed by $35 million, which means if you 10x that, you know, let's say $400 million comes in to the ecosystem, you 100x the price. That's the math of how, you know, these, I don't want to get into the equations and all that, but Uniswap prices function as a square, which means if you 10x the bid side liquidity, you 100x the price. So when you realize that it's actually relatively low liquidity, yes, $35 million is a lot of money, but it's also to our advantage that if just a couple of whales come in here, and a whole bunch of minnows follow on and they FOMO buy because everyone loves buying the tops, you know, all the plebs. It's actually a very pumpable ecosystem. So the mistake a lot of people make is they'll go look at like, oh, the market cap of INC token is so high. It's, you know, $116 million. And they say, oh, if the price 10x, you know, we'd get to $1 billion, and that's just too high of a market cap or something. Like they put on these artificial blinders or limits that don't really exist in their head because they think that the market cap would have to 10x for the coin to 10x. But not all the coins are for sale, right? So there's much less liquidity than there are actual coins for sale. The liquidity is what matters for the price, not as much the market cap, okay? So be careful of thinking to yourself, oh, this coin is already at XYZ market cap. I mean, look at HEX. Look at HEX right here. HEX has an absurdly high market cap, $10 billion market cap. And people might look at that and say, oh, well, how can that possibly pump? The market cap is so high. Well, yeah. 99% of the coins are not on the liquidity pools. 99% of the coins are not for sale. There's only $27 million of the coin for sale. Liquidity matters more than market cap, okay? And when it comes to making the price go up, liquidity matters more than market cap. And the actual stablecoin liquidity matters the most. And it's nice to have some Ethereum liquidity as well, because this means if Ethereum pumps, Hart's Law, PulseChain pumps too. That's why we're all sitting around waiting for Ethereum to pump. We all kind of have the same idea. And just to give you a visual of this, again, remember when I was saying, if you want to exchange USDC for, let's say, HEX, $10,000 worth of USDC will get you about 500,000 HEX. But look at the route. If we expand this and expand this route here, look, first these stables are going through the stablecoin pool, then they're pushing the price up of Pulse, then they're pushing the price up of HEX. So they're routing to the DAI Pulse liquidity pool, and they're routing to the Pulse HEX liquidity pool. So when you buy something at the endpoint, you push up everything in its path. So Pulse goes up too when you buy HEX using stablecoins. Pretty interesting concept. Try to think about it. This is a nice visual, right? The actual route itself lets you visualize kind of the Hart's Law concept we're talking about here. I don't want to drag this video on too much longer. I hope you learned something. Remember, just click this button up here. For example, if you wanted to see HEX in Pulse terms, right? HEX is now worth about 300 Pulse. But where will this ratio go? You could draw lines on charts like we all do. We all try to predict the future by drawing support and resistance lines and making triangles and shapes. But nobody has a crystal ball. So if you're going to do LP, expect impermanent loss, and what else? Try to pull out at the same point you put in, same ratio. Flip to the ratio, because that's what matters for impermanent loss. That's what matters for price number go up. And realize that when you're trading on something like the HEX Pulse pair, the only two coins in this liquidity pool are HEX and Pulse. All these dollar values are derived from the actual PLS price after the fact. Right? But at the end of the day, a liquidity pool is just two coins paired to each other, 50% HEX, 50% Pulse. We could even prove that down here. Look, 792 million HEX for sale, 233 billion Pulse on the other side of this pair. Which, by the way, guys, HEX is getting pretty scarce, right? Not even a billion coins left for sale. 792 million. That's only 792 people that can own a million HEX right now. So if you're in that million HEX club, congratulations. I don't see any more liquidity getting added to this pool. It used to be like 900 million. Now it's less than 800. So when things really kick off, 1 million seems like a nice round number to get to. The 1 million HEX club is going to become a very exclusive club over time. Guys, if you like this video, share it, leave a comment. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and just help educate everybody in the ecosystem so we could all be smarter. PulseChain users are basically the power users of crypto. We're pretty smart. And if you're new here, this is a little more advanced. This is a little more eye-opening. You might even understand what's going on with all this, Solana rug pull factory stuff too. If you can understand ratios a little bit better and liquidity better, maybe you won't be, the new guy at the poker table next time when you're out there doing whatever you're doing, whether it's Solana, Base, Ethereum, or PulseChain. I'll see you on the next video.